Good morning. We're here on the record in the Public Service Commission in case number 2020-0018, electronic investigation into the operational capacity and infrastructure of Grayson Rural Electric Cooperative Corporation. My name is Michael Schmidt. I'm chairman of the Public Service Commission. I will be presiding today. And joining me via video conferencing is Vice Chairman Kent Chandler and Dr. Talina Matthews. At this time, I would normally caution attendees to please set your cellular phones to silent mode or turn them off. Due to the current state of emergency in Kentucky, the Commission is hosting this hearing by video conferencing. Since this continues to be a learning experience for everyone, there are a few suggestions that I would offer. In addition to the normal courtesies regarding cell phones, these tips may help with clarity and avoid feedback issues for the video conference hearing. First, mute your microphone and your video if you are not speaking. Attorneys, when interjecting, please state your name so the video record is clear. If you use a phone for the audio and a computer for the video, turn off the computer audio. Otherwise, there will be feedback. If you are in a room with several other people on their own computers, turn off the computer audio for all but one computer. Otherwise, there will be feedback. If another participant is in a nearby office, close the doors between the offices. Sound carries further than one thinks, which can cause feedback. Once in the GoToMeeting software platform, go to your settings. The icon looks like a gear. To ensure the microphone setting is on the microphone you are using, there's a pull-down menu feature in GoToMeeting, settings that will list the available microphones. Use wired headphones or wired earbuds for better sound quality. Wired is preferred because wireless devices may lose power depending upon the length of the hearing. Keep a charger nearby in case your battery runs low. And please alert the Commission if you are experiencing technology failure that prevents your participation at any of these proceedings. Attorneys should contact staff at the previously provided cell phone number. I will say that in a fair amount of these hearings we've held, at some point in time and another, it's not unusual for one party or another to be disconnected or to lose contact. If we know that, we will stop the proceedings immediately and do what we can to basically make contact with whoever has been cut off. But if there is a problem, and you know there's a problem or that someone else has one, please bring that to our attention as soon as possible so that we can take care of it. This hearing today is for the purpose of taking evidence on the infrastructure management and operations audit conducted by the Liberty Consulting Group. At this time, we will have entry of appearance of counsel and witnesses. Given the unique challenges of conducting a video hearing, I will also request that each party's counsel also identify their witnesses at this time. Now first, I understand Liberty is not represented by counsel but has 3 witnesses here. Would each witness for Liberty please identify yourself, please, for the record?
Yes, my name is John Antonock.
Is there another Mr. Antonock?
Yes, this is Michael Antonock from Liberty.
Okay, and the third witness?
This is Mark Lautenschlager with Liberty.
Thank you. Now, for Grayson RECC, as I understand it, Mr. Oswald, you're representing Grayson, is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
Okay. And what witnesses are here today or with you whose testimony will be taken?
So I have here today with me the witnesses are Bradley Cherry, Kyle Clevenger, Brian Poling, Robert Brown, and Mike Martin. All
right, I've been advised and have seen in the record that public notice has been given and has been filed in the record. Is that, everyone agree that that is correct? Ms. Mansell, that is correct?
That is
isn't it?
correct.
Are there any outstanding motions?
Yes,
Mr.
Chairman, there's one outstanding confidentiality motion
Okay.
that staff will address as soon as possible.
All right, at this time, we'll consider or take public comment. Should anyone from the public like to provide the commission with public comment, instructions to call in are located on the website psc.ky.gov. The phone lines will remain open for several minutes at the start of this hearing and close if there are no callers or after everyone has had an opportunity to speak. Should you call in, please state your name and address for the record before making your statement, and please keep your comments to 5 minutes or less. If there is more than one caller, staff will announce each commenter in turn. Please be respectful and allow one person to make a statement at a time. It should be noted that comments may always be submitted on the PSC's website at psc.ky.gov. All right, at this time, we're ready to begin taking testimony from Liberty Consulting Group. And with the
Chair-
three Liberty
Chairman?
witnesses. Yes.
I'm sorry, do you want to do the public comment?
Oh,
first?
we've never had a public comment yet by phone, so I apologize. I jumped ahead. Let's give it about 5 minutes to see if anyone actually is on the line and cares to make a comment.
Okay, good morning. This is the Public Service Commission. This is the public comment line for case number 2020-00018. Is there anyone on the line? No, there appears to be no one on the line.
Okay. All right, so we'll now begin taking testimony from the Liberty Consulting Group witnesses. Would each of the Liberty witnesses please raise your right hand? Do each of you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Mansell, do you have questions for these witnesses? Or you can ask them to proceed with a summary of their report if you
Okay.
choose.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I think if, Mr. Antonik, if Liberty will move forward with the summary of the audit report.
Yes, thank you. First, let me say it's a pleasure to be back in Kentucky, but doing it virtually is a pale imitation of the real thing. We performed a focused management and operations audit of Grayson Rural Electric Cooperative Corporation. The work of our audit addressed how it plans for, constructs, maintains, and replaces its outside plant. We issued and examined responses to 80 data requests covering both cost and performance data and management and operating practices. We also conducted meetings and interviews with key personnel. We began with a video-based interview session and followed it with a 3-day inspection of outside plant facilities along 300 miles of circuit corridors. During that inspection, we visually examined equipment and vegetation conditions, pardon me, and observed pole replacement and tree removal activities. We also went to Grayson's headquarters and other company facilities to examine work practices and operations there. And we concluded our interviews with a day of in-person, a 1-day session in person at Grayson's facilities. After our work began to focus on specific findings, we participated in a video roundtable session with management and members of the staff. This session gave management the opportunity to provide comments and additional information it considered relevant before we completed our report addressing final conclusions and recommendations. It's important to note that our work did not repeat the examination of matters addressed by the other recent audit of Grayson, although we did look for any indications of failures by management to prioritize or to fund projects important to safety and reliability. We organized our audit work and the report summarizing it on the basis of the following areas of examination: capital project planning, engineering and design, capital project management, O&M work planning and management, application of technologies, workplace practices, inspection and maintenance, vegetation management, restoration and retirement, reliability programs, inventory and facility management, and safety training. Moving now to our findings, it's important to note first that Grayson is by any measure a small utility organization comparatively. Its staff is organized in 4 departments and consists of 40 employees. We focused on 2 of those 4 departments, the 6-person technical services organization and the 22-person operations organization. 14 of these 22 operations personnel are line workers. The other dozen or so Grayson personnel whose work we did not examine perform finance, accounting, and member service functions. Grayson operates a distribution-only system, taking supply and receiving transmission services from EKPC. It has only 43 primary distribution circuits, but importantly, they extend across a very long length when compared to other operations, almost 2,000 miles in fact. The length of those circuits and the terrain they cross have substantial reliability and cost consequences for Grayson. For example, the trucks it uses to maintain the system have no direct access to well over half the length of these 43 circuits that collectively span almost 2,000 miles. As a result, Grayson has to spend comparatively more to produce comparatively lower reliability when compared to other organizations. The dilemma this creates is finding cost reduction opportunities that do not come at the expense of even lower reliability, or alternatively, seeking reliability improvements that do not further increase costs already at levels that produce interest, if not outright concern. Thus, we look for reliability enhancing methods that would not add significant costs and for savings that would not materially affect reliability. We found much of what Grayson does in managing and operating its system effective. For example, design, maintenance, and configuration of its distribution circuits, operations organizations and alignments of functions and resources, capital and work planning, engineering organization, resources and methods, emergency response and disaster recovery planning, purchasing and warehousing operations, field work practices and safety, outage management and response, transformer inspection and maintenance, and field work and safety practices. Nevertheless, a number of possible changes offer the potential for improving reliability at low or at no cost. Training internal resources to perform hotline work, for example, will avoid outages that Grayson takes just to permit it to conduct maintenance work. Giving workers the capability to perform hotline work would improve a key reliability measure, CAIDI, Customer Average Interruption Duration Index. It may also have the added benefit of producing small cost savings by displacing contractor work. The contractors are now brought in when hotline work that does occur is required. Another reliability measure, adopting a more programmatic and analytical approach for work on worst performing circuits, would have the benefit of better targeting actions to improve reliability. In other words, producing more reliability bang for the buck spent. In addition, reducing the number of outages resulting from unknown causes can do the same. As another measure, moving from less reliable ways for identifying poles needing replacement to a ground line inspection and treatment program can also lead to better targeted replacements, thus improving reliability or producing the same reliability results for lesser expenditures. It may reduce costs if the program identifies fewer poles requiring replacement. To give you some perspective, replacement numbers have amounted to about 4,000 poles since 2010, and replacement budgets for the next 2 years are in the range of $1.5 million each year. This data makes reductions in replacements a valuable opportunity for pursuit. Management can also better target its pole inspection and, in turn, replacement program by more effectively determining the vintages of the large number of poles whose age it cannot presently determine. In order to support reliability, Grayson also needs to expand removal of off right-of-way trees whose falls threaten distribution circuits. Moving now more to the area of costs. A drop in vegetation management expenditures has left Grayson unable to employ its standard 8-year treatment cycle. Management needs to reverse that drop to maintain reliability over time, but importantly, not necessarily at the high levels it is proposed. It should, in our view, work with an arborist to optimize the cycles it uses to manage rights-of-way in the varying areas that its service territory and facilities cover. Grayson can benefit substantially from at least temporary use of a utility-experienced arborist to optimize its cycles and to design and implement the enhanced hazard tree removal program I mentioned just previously. Use of an arborist will at least offer better reliability results for dollars spent. It may as well mitigate Grayson's proposed increase in vegetation management expenditures. Finally, in the area of costs, we found high worker overtime levels. Finding ways to reduce them can help manage its costs better. I would like to conclude by thanking both Grayson and the staff for the support both gave to our audit work. Our data requests challenged a small management team whose responses showed attention and care in providing us with complete information. And as has ever been the case in our long association with the Kentucky Commission, your staff assisted us greatly in coming up to speed and in progressing through our audit work with as much dispatch as we were able to manage. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you. I do have a few questions to follow up. What I'm going to do is both Mr. Antonuck and Mr. Lautenschlager, I'm just going to ask the question, and whichever of you can best answer it, please do so. Looking at vegetation management, as you've mentioned, one of the recommendations was the increased vegetation management activities, and as the report noted, the purpose of vegetation management, or the primary purpose, is for reliability and not cost reduction. Given that, can we talk about vegetation management metrics? Do vegetation management metrics based upon either the number of years in a maintenance cycle or the dollars spent per mile directly address reliability?
Mark, go ahead.
That's a hard question to answer because I can tell you directly that their reliability because of trees in the lines has not been an issue. The problem has been the trees falling into the lines. Big part of their problem is, big part of their advantage is they have pretty wide right-of-ways. So trees is not, they've done a good job clearing the trees from the right-of-ways. They have to maintain access to the lines where they're off-road to get access to do their repairs and construction work and that sort of thing. So reliability caused by the vegetation management program. If the vegetation management was reduced, they'd have a harder time getting access to the lines because the brush would be in the way. But if they decrease their 8-year cycle, they'll have difficulty. That will directly affect reliability if they can't get to do their work. In fact, I was rather impressed that their tree-caused reliability, other than trees falling into the lines, has been quite good. So the issue here is we think that they need to concentrate a little bit more on identifying and removing trees that might fall into the lines. So cost, no. I guess the answer is the cost is not directly relative to reliability. But if you back off vegetation management too much, your reliability will suffer. And it's been seen by other utilities that's cut back their vegetation management programs.
Let me, if I could, just to mention one aspect about the metric of costs, vegetation management as an O&M expense is many times the prime target for short-term reductions in costs. And one of the reasons that's true is that a short-term reduction doesn't necessarily show very directly or very quickly in reduced reliability. And that actually can produce a misleading sense of confidence that you can sustain reductions for the long term. So yeah, we always look at changes in expenditures over time. We look at cycles. We look at how well cycles are tailored to conditions, but we do not place a lot of reliance on a short-term reduction as a problem indicator. The issue comes much more long-term when you persistently cut vegetation management expenditures. Eventually, as Mark mentioned, you create access problems, which are particularly critical for these folks, but you also increase the chance of vegetation contact with the conductors as well. So
The result is that you would have a much higher expense later trying to catch up, particularly when you have only an 8-year cycle. That means if you would go to a 15-year cycle, you would have major expenses each year trying to catch up, and your reliability would also suffer.
Mr. Lautenschlager, did you consider the 8-year cycle sufficient, given the terrain, given all the conditions?
Yes, it appears to be sufficient. Most utilities have 4 or 5-year cycles, but they don't. The utilities I've looked at don't have the wide right-of-ways that you have in Kentucky, and that's an advantage, those wide right-of-ways, in terms of tree limbs contacting. Most of the issues with tree limbs is on private property and from consumers' trees. So that's where most of that issue is, I believe. On the along the right-of-ways, the big issue is brush. They have a lot of brush growing in their right-of-ways, and they have to keep that down so they not only stays out of the lines, they have to be able to get to the lines.
And it's correct though that Grayson has a spraying program that I think is one year of the first spraying. You go back again. Is it I forget if it's 2 or 4 years, and then start over again at 8 years. Does that sound like the right? I mean,
that sounds right. Now, Mr. Terry could answer that a little better than me, but I think that's what we had in the report.
Let me move over to pole inspections, and I just want to make sure that the record is clear about. I think the report set it forth pretty clearly, but I just wanted to follow up and make sure if you could just briefly explain why the current inspection process used by Grayson it is not sufficient in terms of the reliability of the outcome.
The standard practice with utilities, if you have a pole inspection program, is to not only just sound the poles, which they do every 2 years. The sounding process is to identify hollow spots. But it's a little more than that, is how big is the hollow spots? These hollow spots are created by decay, insects, and fungus. And in order to evaluate each pole, you need to bore the poles, use a device that measures the size of any hollow spots. This is also below the ground as well. It should dig down 18 inches around the butt of the pole and bore the pole and identify how big the hollow spot is below the ground line and above the ground line, if there are hollow spots. And then you take a measurement to determine the shell thickness of the pole. From that measurement, it can be determined what the loss of strength of the pole is. And a lot of these poles are the smaller size poles that can't tolerate a lot of decay or minimum shell thickness. So this is somewhat scientific, more than what they're doing, which is evaluating the poles basically just by listening to the sound when they hit it with a hammer. If you're going to try to identify which poles to replace, you really need to do it using a process that has been utility good practice of boring the poles, measuring the shell thickness. You don't have to do it if you don't hear any hollow spots. But and then also the additional service here is once you've drilled the hole, bored into the pole, you can fill any hollow spots with preventative chemicals that stop any further deterioration and can extend the life of that pole. Poles should last 60 years or more. And if you're in a wet area, particularly if you're in a wet area, a pole can deteriorate much quicker than that in 30, 40 years. So, but instead of just identifying, the concern here is that before you replace a pole, which is about a $3,500 operation, you need to properly identify that pole really needs replacement. I mean, there might be some issues on the exterior pole that would indicate that pole should be replaced, but before you spend a lot of money, this is a major expense to Grayson RECC, as well as Vegetation Management. It just seems logical that you would use an expert to identify which poles need to be replaced. And there are several contractors that do this work, and I've watched them do the work, and they can go through, do a number of poles a day with a two-man team and follow the line down to identify the pole. Now, in the report, I suggested a 10-year cycle for a pole testing program. That means you test 1/10 of the poles one-tenth of the poles that are over 20 years old every 10 years. Now, many utilities extend that to 15-year cycles. So, I mean, we'd be open to that consideration to reduce the cost of this program. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did, very well. Thank you very much. I just have one last question, and this is more of to do with the poles, the utility poles of an unknown age. One of the questions that has come up is with pole inspections that the commission regulations require every 6 years. How is it possible not to have some documentation of the age of a utility pole? And I wondered if you could speak to that.
Well, a lot of utilities have the same issue. What happens is a lot of poles get replaced in, after storm work. They're not all poles are replaced because of an inspection program where they can be tracked for replacement. Often they're included in major rebuild projects. Not all poles may be replaced during a project, and utilities haven't been really good on maintaining records concerning when a pole was installed to track the age of the pole. Grayson went through and identified the age of their poles 2 or 3 years ago, I believe, when they had an inspection program going on. And the poles numbers on some of the poles, or the pole birth dates they call them, had faded because of sunlight. So that's what I was told. So apparently when they do know when this birth date is on the pole, they can identify the age, but otherwise they seem to be having problems identifying the age of the other poles where the birth date is faded away.
And Mr. Lautenschlager, I remember during one of our stops on the inspection, we looked at a pole that had the faded out birth date, so you couldn't tell for sure what the age was.
The only way you can do that is two ways of doing that probably. If you go through all the records, which would be very time consuming to try to identify when poles were replaced. But I have no idea how difficult that might be for Grayson RECC to do that, or if it's even possible. Now, the other way is if they do a pole inspection program using a specialized contractor, he can identify the condition of the pole, and some judgment could be made on if this is actually a 10-year pole, 20-year pole, 30-year pole kind of thing. That would help identify which age group each pole is in that's not identified with the birth date.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions, Chairman.
Vice Chairman Chandler, questions?
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning.
Morning.
I just reading, and I'll have to ask Mr. Oswald later who I can talk to about the basis for the comments, but reading Mr. Oswald's comments in response, the ones that were filed last night.
Video. Can you, Mr. Chandler, can you stop a minute? We've lost video contact here. We may have lost audio. Oh,
Yeah, we can hear you.
okay. Well, let's see if we can reestablish our video. Let's go into recess for maybe 5 to 10 minutes until we can see if we can get the problem repaired. Okay, we'll be in recess. Okay, Mr. Chandler, are you on? Commissioner Matthews? Okay, Commissioner Matthews, you're mute, but that's okay if you don't.
I don't have any questions.
All right.
I don't have any questions.
Vice Chairman Chandler hadn't had an opportunity to ask his questions yet because did each of you lose video contact, or was it just us here in the hearing room?
It was just the hearing room.
Okay, Vice Chairman, I guess you were beginning to ask questions.
Yeah, my apologies. I literally stepped away. I was thinking maybe I had 1 minute, but apparently I didn't. So it was bad timing on my part. So thank you. Yeah, my I don't know if the folks from Liberty have had a chance to look at the comments that were filed. By Grayson. I've got a letter I think may have been filed in the record yesterday, but one of the responses to the report, in item 3 talks about how some of the specific recommendations would result in higher costs. And the quote here is, for example, the recommendations concerning the hiring of an arborist and for increasing the budget for right-of-way clearing would create higher costs of cooperative. Naturally, additional right-of-way clearing will generally result in greater costs or greater reliability, excuse me. However, every utility must balance the interest of reliability against the cost of the utility and its resulting ratepayers. And then it goes on to talk about how the commission noted Grayson's distribution costs per mile were quite high in comparison to its peers. And that Grayson explained during the hearing that one of the primary factors in its distribution costs is the maintenance of right-of-ways in terrain that is quite challenging. So that's, I guess, when I see the recommendation about spending more on vegetation management, my question is, is the recommendation to spend more, or is the recommendation to do more vegetation management, or is it to do it differently? I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to differentiate cost, right? Like dollars and cents versus an actual activity that you all are recommending, or the utility doing something different in practice. I can't tell if you all are saying that their current practice is inadequate, or you're just saying that your recommendation would be that they spend more or they do more of it. I think you're on mute, Mr. Antonoff.
All right. First of all, Michael, have we lost Mark?
Mark, are you with us?
Let me start. Mike, why don't you work on that? It's certainly the case that more off right away tree removal will be a cost adder on a recurring basis. It is also clear that restoration of some portion of the cut that has been made in vegetation management should be restored. So you have to look at that in this context, though. They're proposing a pretty significant increase in vegetation management costs. Using an arborist to help them identify how they should tailor cycles will affect how much of that increase proposed will actually be needed. It could be if you look at that increase as just restoring a former cost, I would say that working with an arborist to tailor the cycles and to work on the off right-of-way removal program isn't necessarily going to increase costs relative to what they were before they were cut. So it's partly this is semantics. Also, the costs that we talk about relative to the arborists are effectively a one-time cost. The idea is to use an arborist to design better how they conduct vegetation management. So I look at that as a fairly nominal cost to begin with, and it's one time. The cost of the change in how to plan for pole removal, there will be recurring costs for that. But, if you think about $1.5 million a year in what they plan to spend to remove poles, it won't take very much of a reduction in poles, in pole removals to actually end up producing that saving. So I don't think it's clear, necessary, or even really probable that there will be material cost increases resulting from the recommendations. As I noted in my comments, we particularly tried to make sure that we weren't looking at, I'll call them cost aggravating ways of moving forward here, but low cost ways of moving forward, or ways that actually might serve to reduce some costs.
Yeah, but let me ask, ignoring cost for just a minute, in terms of practices, right? I can't tell if you all are saying that their current practice is inadequate, or if you're saying Grayson's practice can be better.
Better. I think is a fair way to put it, because I think we're talking about marginal changes in cost and marginal changes in reliability here. We're not talking about changes big enough that would indicate that they've been wasteful in expenditures or negligent in dealing with reliability. So I look at these as much more in the nature of fine tuning rather than fundamentally changing.
Okay, and I just want to be clear, because I don't know that it came across in the report. You all would say that the vegetation management practices of the utility per your review is adequate, but that you all identify places that they can do better.
That's correct. They're adequate, but they can move more towards optimum by undertaking the recommendations.
Okay, is it more additive things they can do, or doing it differently?
Well, the additive would be the removal of off right-of-way trees. Other than that, I think it's more different. It would be the the optimizing the cycles for base work and changing the methods for determining when to replace poles. So in those cases, those are different ways of doing the same thing.
Our
Mark,
recommendation, this is Mark Luxschlager. Our recommendation is twofold. One is their practices in the past 10 years have produced pretty good reliability in terms of tree contact with lines, other than fallen trees. The issue is, and I had no issue when I observed how their program. However, I'm not a utility arborist experienced in fine-tuning vegetation management programs. So even though I feel that they're doing an adequate job, appropriate job even, at this point, up to this year where they reduced their expenditures on vegetation management, temporarily maybe, before they start expanding another to 2.2 million or whatever it was that they're looking to expand it to, that may be appropriate, but we're not ones to say that. We're not ones to say that they don't have ways, that there may be ways of reducing the costs further than what they've already done. I think they've done some practices where their costs are lower than normal by using local contractors and so forth. However, the way to identify whether the cost should go down or go up or the program cycle should be changed is to bring in an expert in vegetation management, and that's a utility arborist. And maybe some of the other co-ops, we don't know, have made use of utility arborist. Any big utility has 4 or 5 or 6 of these arborists on their staff to run these programs, and they understand the vegetation, for one thing. They understand growth rates, they understand diseases, all of that, and they understand what the most appropriate programs are for each particular territory, and also considering their wide right-of-ways. It's just, we can't make the judgment because we're not utility arborists to determine if their program is optimized as it is. And it may be that an arborist will come in and say their program is just exactly the way it ought to be, but he may also find, or her, may find that if they do something slightly different, it may save a few $100,000 a year. That's the point. It was kind of a double-edged sword. We didn't want to recommend reducing their vegetation management costs because it's been producing pretty good reliability other than for fallen trees. We think they need to address fallen trees. And an arborist would come in and help them identify what to do about fallen trees, if anything, and identify which kind of trees ought to be removed in which locations, which are critical locations that cause big outages. So the one part of the recommendation was don't decrease the vegetation management costs until, or even increase the vegetation management costs until an arborist comes in, reviews the program, and his report will indicate, his analysis will indicate if costs can be reduced or if necessary, costs may have to be increased. I mean, it's we can't say, but we can't say because we need an expert to go into the vegetation management program, spend weeks going into their program and identifying how they're using their contractors, and if they're using their contractors efficiently. You know, we're not saying that they aren't doing anything inefficient. We're just saying that we don't know. And since this is a $2 million program every year, that this is something that ought to be looked at by somebody that has expertise in vegetation management programs.
Yeah, good practice in larger utilities is to use arborists to help design and optimize we recognize that, with a small utility, they can't afford a staff of full-time, 3, probably even 1 long-term. That's why our recommendation was confined to saying you need to work with an arborist over a reasonably short period to make sure that the way you've designed the program is the most cost-effective, meaning it's giving you the biggest bang for the buck. So, they've proposed a pretty substantial increase. I think it was to 2.4 million in vegetation management costs. So I would, if it were me, I would start that arborist off by saying, how can we do it for less than that full 2.4 million, which is up, I want to say from 1.7, but I'm not sure I have that number right. And then, as I said, with respect to the removal of off right-of-way trees, that is going to be a new and additional recurring expenditure. And it certainly is appropriate for the work with the arborist to determine, what the risks are, so that the removal program that they end up with is really cost effective, that they're limiting removals to the trees and conditions and of a state that really are posing a threat.
Well, and I guess I appreciate that. I guess reading Grayson's comments, I think I agree with their perspective that sort of talking about cost, increasing increasing how much they spend on something is a reasonable concern to have if that's just the recommendation in the abstract. So I appreciate that color on it. I guess as a follow-up, maybe I have a myopic view of utility costs, but as I see it, per Grayson's reasonable comments on this issue, that you effectively, the amount of revenues the utility has, we can talk about it like a pie, right? And vegetation management, what they're currently spending is a slice of that, a $2 million, whatever it may be in a given year, slice of that pie. And you all are effectively recommending, as I understand, to increase the slice of that pie to $2.4 million. So if you're saying spend the full amount, right, that buying effect is going to increase the amount of costs. So you either take that money away from something else, you make the pie bigger. I guess maybe given that their costs are higher than everybody else's, you could throw out, trying to blend that cost with somebody with a lower cost, whatever it may be. But if we're talking about doing things differently, did you all identify any costs or any programs on the reliability side where you think that they're putting too much focus on capital or cash, that they should, spend less on X, whatever it may be, and instead focus that money on these out of right-of-way trees, right-of-way, these hazard trees, right-of-way clearing, whatever it may be? Or was it just the idea of spend your full amount that you anticipate you need to spend on vegetation management until you all are able to talk to somebody and figure something out? I'm trying to make sure I understand the takeaway.
Yeah, first let me say, we agree completely with the notion that they need to be concerned about costs. The second, the 2.4 million is not our proposal, it's theirs. The point of our recommendation is to determine whether there is a way to reduce that amount. We think it is likely that the temporary reduction they have made to date is too much. So in a sense, from that perspective, yeah, increasing from where they are today is something we believe should happen. But what we are not accepting is their need to go to the 2.4. That number could become less by undertaking the recommendations that we've made. So the goal there is actually to reduce what they have proposed. Secondly, that's the same with the pole replacement program. They're spending they're proposing to spend $1.5 million on pole replacements. The purpose of our recommendation is to undertake certain expenditures that will provide a more intelligent basis for pole removal, thus reducing the number of poles to be replaced and saving more money than the cost of operating that program from year to year. So we are not fundamentally saying spend more money. We're fundamentally saying spend money through a stronger foundation, using an arborist, using an effective program for determining when to replace poles, the net effect of which we believe is as likely to reduce costs as it is to increase costs. The one area where costs that are not now being incurred that will be incurred through our recommendations is on these off right-of-way trees that present a hazard of falling into the lines. But even there, what we're saying is, don't willy-nilly start taking those trees down. Work with a professional to determine which of the population of trees that are out there are really causing the risk, so that you are spending money only on those. So even there, we're proposing something that while it will, unlike the other areas, clearly increase costs, will do it in a way that is producing commensurate reliability value. That maybe the arborist will say to them that, the risk of this population of trees is so low, it's not worth it. Then nothing happens. Presumably what happens is that once they work to develop an off right-of-way tree removal program, they determine what it's going to cost and what it's going to produce in benefits, and then make an intelligent decision about whether the reliability gain that will result is worth the money.
Yeah, on that point, and I think that's something that Grayson raised in their comments, is the balancing between the cost and reliability benefits of any additional expense or change in expense. I guess my question is, other than poles and vegetation management, did you all identify any practice or any costs that the utility is incurring that you think are providing little to no reliability benefit, or have some sort of is currently experiencing or will soon experience a diminishing return on reliability for the cost incurred?
No, I think the other recommendations I would consider to be fine tuning, and I would expect them to have marginal changes, produce marginal changes in costs and reliability, but nothing that would be sufficient to say that the way they're doing things now is unreasonable.
They do have an opportunity to reduce overtime costs.
Yeah. But that's marginal. That's going to be marginal. I think their total overtime costs are about $270,000. So that, if you reduce the number of poles replaced a year, that's probably worth $400,000 a year if you can reduce the number of poles replaced each year by a quarter. If you cut the vegetation management increase in half cut it in half, that's, I think, probably worth $250,000 or something like that. Over time, maybe you can cut it in half. If you do, that's $100 and some thousand. So that's not really the same level as the opportunities in some of the areas.
I guess I'll say for some of the utilities we regulate, that's a drop in the bucket, but I feel like for at least the majority of the cooperatives, and certainly for Grayson, that's a lot of money. So I
Agreed.
I appreciate it. That's all the questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Matthews, questions?
I don't have any questions other than, have you sat down with Grayson and walked through all of this cumulatively? Because it did look in the report like the focus was on maybe spend more here or spend less here, hire an arborist, but I mean, more of the, I guess, the holistic view of work smarter, not harder, spend money where it makes sense instead of just spending more money.
I believe we did. I think you need to ask them their perspective on that. If they are taking the view that our report said just spend more money, that loses the point we were trying to make, which is to spend money on the basis of a stronger analytical foundation that will demonstrate that you're getting bang for the buck.
And respectfully, we haven't asked them that yet, and the only thing we had to judge was the questions or the comments that they had that were filed last night. So
Yeah, and
That's all I have.
And we would be the last ones to argue that they should be very, very concerned about any source of additional expenditures. You know, that we don't disagree with that perspective, which they have shared with us.
That's all I have, Chairman.
Thank you. I gather that, correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel or found that maybe Grayson's operating expenses were high because of, A, the size of the system in terms of the number of customers, and the large and rugged area which comprised its service territory. Is that essentially correct?
That's fair, yes.
Would, in your opinion, would Grayson's customers and ratepayers be served if merger with another rural electric cooperative were seriously considered or achieved?
Okay. I was thinking about that question this morning. I guess I'm glad you asked it. I don't believe that consolidation with another operation would fundamentally change the field operations that we looked at. It's still going to be low customer density. It's still going to be long distances. It's still going to be inaccessible right away. So from the perspective of the people who are in the trucks, on the ground, climbing the poles, I think all you would gain by consolidation is by putting them with someone more efficient. That way, you would be basically making that enterprise less efficient and this one more efficient. So you would be, in effect, only sharing the pain in that respect, I think. There would be no gain. It would be just a sharing of the pain. Where there is opportunity for consolidation is primarily going to be in the areas we did not look at, which is going to be, finance, accounting, member services. Those are the kinds of areas that are more likely to be productive of cost reductions. There are, forgive me if I get these numbers wrong, they were right in the presentation I made. There are about 12 of those people, and there are 40 minus 12, what's that come out to, 28 in the areas that we looked at. So I wouldn't rule out the fact that you could produce some marginal gain in efficiency by combination, but it would not come significantly from the areas that we were charged with looking at. Therefore, I can't really tell you on a net basis what to expect because we didn't look at those other areas, the areas covered by the other 12 of the 40 employees.
I know that one of your I don't know if it was a recommendation, but contained in the final report was about an engineer. They were using I guess a part-time engineer who was leaving or retiring or something at the end of 2020. What kind of engineering services does Grayson need or should Grayson have that they don't have if they don't have the consultant anymore or the part-time third-party contractor and they don't have an in-house engineer? How are they disadvantaged?
Well, this is Mark Lautenschlager. They'll be disadvantaged because, as I understand, they have to have a professional engineer approve of some projects and to verify that their constructions and rebuild work is consistent with RUS requirements. I can't go into detail on that, but they need to have a professional engineer, at least part-time, familiar with RUS requirements and also they need one to make sure that their engineering chiefs, as they call them, who do design, their ex-linemen, they're very technical and very hardworking and very knowledgeable, but they've been using the professional engineer as a backup to provide information to these engineering chiefs to ensure that when they design a little project, that it's consistent with our U.S. requirements. So they're going to have to find somebody that meets the requirements, that is familiar with the RUS specifications, and is a Kentucky certified professional engineer. So I just think they're going to have to do that one way or another. I mean, they could end up hiring one full time and use them as an engineering chief. I mean, that's not our decision, but it's their decision, and they know more about it than we do. We just know that they need to have this professional engineer available at their beck and call.
On the on outages, you found, I guess, that their outages were maybe higher than average, and the outages lasted longer than average. Is that essentially correct?
I believe so.
And so what, in your opinion, is the result or is the cause of more frequent outages and the fact that it takes more time to basically restore service?
Well, number one, the fall of trees can do damage that requires lengthy repairs. That causes more lengthy outages. They, when they bring a contractor in to do hotline work, if they don't do hotline work, it takes longer to do repairs, so the maintenance outages are higher. But it's basically because of getting access to inaccessible almost areas where they have a problem with service, just getting there because they can't get their big vehicles into all these locations, and they have to manhandle and use special equipment to get back in there, is what I understand.
That's what you were told, is that correct?
Yeah, and I observe, of course, some of these areas where they have to get into, and they're obviously very difficult access. Now, they corrected one situation a few years ago. They had, apparently, when these lines were built, they were back in the 40s, whatever, they must have required that the circuits follow the shortest distances and not necessarily go along the highway right-of-ways. And that's caused a lot of these more than half of their circuits to be in the heavily wooded area where the access is limited, and they have to maintain those 20-foot right-of-ways just get it into those areas by foot and by all-terrain vehicles. So so what they did is, at one location, they replaced, rather than rebuild the circuit where it was going through the forested area, they built it around along the highway, but at considerable extra expense. But it was probably the right thing to do because now they have access to that circuit.
You talked about poles and pole replacements and the need for testing. One thing I didn't understand is the relationship of their testing procedures. 10%, 11% of their poles per year are replaced, maybe, and replacement is based upon, I guess, recommendations by the linemen or by people in the field. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, their maintenance line workers inspect they're continuously looking at their circuits in their areas, operating areas. But they also formally inspect their circuits every 2 years. And I'm told that they sump the poles, with, that sound the poles, they thump it with a hammer. And they inspect the poles, external condition, and they make a determination whether the pole should be replaced. What we're suggesting is, instead of doing that, is to use a specialized pole testing, ground line testing contractor that goes through there and inspects the poles in a more scientific way to determine if poles actually need to be replaced. Some poles actually can be reinforced at a lower cost than it takes to replace a pole. Just do a more scientific method of identifying which poles need to be replaced, and rather than identifying a pole by the consideration of a line worker, which he may be right, but he may not be right. That's the issue.
Well, I mean, I was looking at your chart, it had distribution of pole ages, and apparently they have maybe 35,347 poles. I think this is page 16 of your report. And of that, you know, you have different scopes. You know, they have between 30 and 39 ages 30 and 39 years, 3,374 poles. 40 plus poles are, there are 1,902, and 9,948 poles of unknown age. I guess what I'm saying is you don't know, if you don't know how old some of these poles are and they're located in remote areas, shouldn't there be some systematic way of, I think is what you recommend, of testing these poles?
Right, they would have to be included in the pole testing program. And possibly, if they identify them as probably less than 10 years old, they would not be, they would just, they would not include that in the program at that point. But yeah, you have to include those in the program until you identify what their condition is and how old they are. And you'll probably never know exactly how old they are, but somebody that looks at poles every day, they would be able to identify whether it was an aged pole, or they can tell by the type of pole for one reason. You know, poles have different preservatives, and depending on the type of preservative used on the pole, they can kind of determine approximate age.
Well, shouldn't you be able to pretty well determine the useful life of a pole?
Yeah, about 60 years plus.
I mean, at the rate of replacing, say, 1% a year, you'd basically get through the entire number of poles in 100 years.
Yeah.
Isn't that about right?
Yes. But you gotta know what you're replacing the right poles.
Well, I guess that's right. I mean, Kentucky's a wet state in terms of, has a lot of rainfall, probably like Pennsylvania. Let me ask you this. I noticed on your top 95% of 2018, 2019 outage causes, and under unknown causes was basically 8% in 2019, which represented 116,000 events. Why is it not possible to determine a cause in those instances?
Well, it could have been lightning, that they didn't have any way of identifying where the lightning was the cause or not. Now, big utilities, they have sophisticated methods of identifying when lightning strikes their lines by having a service that identifies lightning strikes. We're not proposing that they go to the expense of identifying lightning activity as a probable cause. And because if lightning was the cause, then they may have to go look and see if they need more arresters. However, you're never going to get rid of all the unknown causes. It's just that the line workers need to be need to understand that it's very important for the engineering staff to identify causes. And in one case, I think the cause was a lot higher than 8%. But they've been improving their reducing their unknown causes, I believe, over the last few years. And some utilities have sessions with their step inspection teams or for their line workers that shows them what to look for, and they talk to each other and then to help identify what the cause might have been. And even though many cases you should have a probable cause maybe rather than an unknown cause based on not finding anything, but also identifying if it's in a wooded area, you might have to make some assumptions to identify probable cause. And it might be, of course, animals is an issue, and they are installing animal protectors, and they're trying to install them wherever they have animal-caused outages. They do that activity of installing these animal guards. So it's kind of a small issue. It's just a recommendation to keep their line workers on their toes and to understand that they need to try to identify the most probable cause so that the cause can be included in their reliability work that they do, which is mainly animal protection, and if they need to lightning arresters, that kind of thing.
I noted that one of the recommendations was, I think, or one of the observations was that although Grayson had linemen who were qualified to perform hotline work, that management basically was referring all that work out to third-party contractors. Did they indicate to you why they did that?
They couldn't, I asked the question, they couldn't explain it. It was something to do with previous management.
With previous what, sir?
Management.
Previous management. Who was the contractor? Did you find out or did you ask? Do you know who the
No,
third-party contractor was?
No, it's the one they use. I don't think I obtained I think I did. I heard the name, but I didn't think that was important to know who it was.
Yeah, we have the name. I don't recall it, but we know the contractor they use.
I just have one more question, and that is, if an arborist were employed basically to assess trees that need to be removed, would that person also be qualified to assess the value of a tree for purposes of negotiation with the landowner of adjoining property?
Commonly, that is the case.
Thank you. I have.
However, if the tree is dying or dead, if it's a ash tree, for instance, that's dying, the owner should be glad to get rid of the tree.
Oh, I understand. I don't disagree there. I just assume that in the process of removing some trees on other people's property, that there might be some claim to damages. And I know there are people who work in areas near the Daniel Boone National Forest, which is not far from Grayson, that basically appraise trees for pipeline contractors and others, I guess landowners. So that would be one of the services that this type of professional could also perform. You'd expect them to be able to provide an estimate of the value of the tree, or it had no value at all in terms of market value.
It sounds reasonable.
All right, Mr. Oswald, I have no further questions. Do you have any questions of any or all of these witnesses?
I have just a few, Mr. Chairman. It sounds like to me that what you're saying is that most of the outages that you identified were from trees that were outside of the right-of-way falling onto the lines. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And so the use of an arborist could help the cooperative identify those and prevent those. Is that correct?
Yes, to some degree.
I could be wrong about this, but I think there's other cooperatives in this area that use somebody for that purpose that may not necessarily be a certified arborist. The chairman mentioned the proximity to Daniel Boone National Forest, and there may be retired forestry people. Would somebody like that be adequate for that purpose, or is it extremely important that they be a technically certified arborist?
Well, it sounds like you still need an arborist to look at your overall vegetation management program. Now, if he agrees that another person, a forester kind of person, to help you assess the hazard tree issue, that sounds like a reasonable method. But I would not think that a forester, as you're talking about, would understand a vegetation management program unless he would provide equivalency to a certified arborist. I mean, he'd have to provide that information. I think the certified arborist just makes you feel comfortable that this person knows what he's doing with vegetation management and hazard trees. However, you could have another qualified person with equivalent experience and knowledge, I suppose. But then again, why don't he become an arborist and get certified?
I think the problem here is if you get someone who is more in the nature of a forester to deal with the off right-of-way trees, that would be fine, but you still have the need for someone to help you design and tailor the cycles, and that is going to take a different set of skills. You know, it's going to be kind of growth rates and kind of how species interact with clearing and all that. So I think the problem would be trying to find an economical way to kind of bring both of those skills through two different people as opposed to trying to combine them in one. But it's certainly a possibility if you can do it. I think you make a good point about the skills for addressing the off right-of-way tree issue. It'd really be a matter of trying to design the relationship in a way that was economical while supporting both needs.
In the action plans that Liberty prepared, I think this is on page 20, if you guys have access to that, but I wanted to ask you just briefly about the pole inspection program that you had talked about, and treating poles with fungicides and insecticides. And under heading 4, where it says expected improvement and implementation timeline, there's a projected cost identified, which I think came from management at Grayson, but a total of $90,000 for the inspection and $126,000 if insecticide is included. But then in the next paragraph, under heading 5A, it says changing the 10-year cycle to 15 would reduce the cost to $10,000. And should that be reduced by 10,000, or I was just confused?
I know 100,000. That's a typo.
Yeah.
200,000. Okay, gotcha.
I don't know how it does that.
Well, that's okay. I just noticed it myself, actually. But so, is it fair for me to say here then that cost of 100,000 is just for the treatment of the poles, for the fungicide and insecticide, and then and that's a yearly cost, and then there's another $90,000 cost per year for the inspection, for a total of $190,000 per year.
No, that's not what we understood from your response. Maybe the response was misunderstood, but the response came from the response that if you included, it would go from 90,000 to, if you included treatment, it'd go up to 126,000.
Okay.
That's what we took your response to say.
Okay, but is that an annual cost then?
Yes, that's what we understood your response to say,
Okay.
per year. That'd be for a 10-year cycle, and then if you went with a 15-year cycle, that should reduce a couple of things. It reduce the cost of the inspection, and also reduce the number of poles that you're probably would replace as a result of the inspection every year.
Is there any way to determine that before the cooperative would embark on a program like that, of having someone do this inspection and expending that money? Is there any way that we can definitively determine that, whether the savings would equal that cost or would exceed that cost?
Well, you reported that the replacement of a pole has been around $3,500, and that in the future it's going to go up to $4,500. I think I have it in the report. And so it would not take, you would, if you went on, it's hard to say. We just can't say. All we're saying is, we don't know whether the poles that you're replacing could have lasted another 20 years, just based on thumping the pole and then external inspection. We think since you spend so much money on replacing poles, that in order to justify those costs of $1.5 million, that it'd be worthwhile spending $100,000 a year to verify which poles need to be replaced, and also the poles that are marginal condition, their life can be extended by another 20 years by treating those poles.
Determining ahead of time obviously isn't possible, but it certainly would make sense to be looking at the results of the program in terms of changes in replacement numbers based on past experience. Also looking at data on pole failures that were sort of not caught through the inspection program. So, this isn't something that we're saying, embark on this and stick with it no matter what the results are. Obviously, it would make sense to be observing what changes you're seeing in replacement rates, what changes you're seeing in pole failures, as a way of making sure that the way you're carrying this out makes sense. And it isn't necessarily a binary choice of kind of continuing or stopping. It's also a question of changing the cycles. As Mark said, 10 years is a pretty common one, but 15 in your circumstances wouldn't be unreasonable as a starting point. So we would absolutely recommend that if you embark on this, that you pay very close attention to the results you're getting for the money you're spending.
Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions I have.
Ms. Mansell, anything further of Liberty witnesses?
No, nothing further.
Vice Chairman Chandler, questions?
I have no additional questions.
Dr. Matthews, anything further?
I have no additional questions either.
Neither do I at this point. Why don't we, I guess before we get into Liberty or Grayson RECC's witnesses for a few questions, why don't we take a break until 11 o'clock, and then we can decide basically how to proceed and whether Liberty's witnesses will be necessary for the remainder of the proceeding, okay? So we'll be in recess until 11 a.m. and then we'll come back and try to wind up. Thank you. Okay, we're now back on the record. After discussion with Ms. Vinsel, she'd like the Liberty witnesses to remain because she may have some follow-up questions, or get some maybe definitional responses after she has an opportunity to speak to the RECC, Grayson RECC witnesses. Okay, at this time, do you expect that that Mr. Oswald will conduct a direct examination first and you'll cross, or will you conduct an examination and give Mr. Oswald the opportunity to conduct a redirect?
What I was going to suggest is that Mr. Oswald have the opportunity to do a direct if he chooses.
Okay. All right, well, Mr. Oswald, you have a number of witnesses there. Do you intend to basically ask a few questions of basically all of your witnesses?
I do, Mr. Chairman, and would it be helpful if I just had them all introduce themselves and state what position they hold?
If they would introduce themselves, and then after they have done that, I'll ask them to raise their right hands, and we'll just swear them all in as a group, and then you can tell us which witness you're calling first. One of the things I want to say to you, though, is that in the past, when we've had counsel and witnesses all at the same table, it's difficult to know who's talking. I mean, you may say, well, it's Mr. So-and-so, and he is across the table from me in a plaid shirt. But obviously, you've got masks, you can't see, and sometimes it's not bad. You have a nice hearing room. We've had some in municipal city council rooms where you could just barely even see the witness. So it is important that if at some point in time some other witness comes in and says something or is asked a question out of turn, maybe we ought to always make sure they identify themselves, because the reporter here won't know. She could see, for instance, each of the three Liberty witnesses on the screen, but she'll just see your people as a group, okay? Would you either introduce your witnesses or ask your witnesses to introduce themselves?
All right, Mr. Chairman, we'll just go around the table here, and I'll just ask each of you guys to just state your name for the record and state what position that you hold here at Grayson.
My name is Robert Brown. I'm the GIS technician at Grayson. Mike Martin, Assistant Manager of Operations.
Kyle Clevenger, Manager of Operations.
Brian Foley, Manager of Technical Services.
Hey, I'm Bradley Cherry, Interim President and CEO.
Okay. Yeah, suddenly the image appeared much better on the screen. Was that something they did? Did you see it was larger? We could actually see the facial features?
Yes, Chairman. I had said for the Liberty witnesses, if they wanted to turn off their videos,
Okay.
but they're remaining within hearing distance, so if we ask them a question.
Okay, and then, all right, so that's what
So that's-
resulted in the,
Yes.
thank you. All right, Mr. Wood, now, we don't have witnesses now, do we?
We don't have them there.
All right, we're back, we're back on again. Can we increase the size of the, I guess, the screen or the video that shows Grayson's people?
If we do that, yeah, Jim is, our IT command is working on this. Potentially view who's talking would provide that larger view.
All right, fine.
It's
I-
gonna switch like that, Chairman.
It is? Okay.
Yes, you're right.
Well, would each of the witnesses for Grayson Rural Electric please raise your right hands? Do you solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. Mr. Oswald, will you call your first witness? Be sure to announce the name so the court reporter can get it, and then you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just have a few questions here, really just, I think, to clarify some things that might speed things up today, but would it be acceptable for us to do this in a panel fashion as well? Because frankly, I'm not sure which of my witnesses might be the most informed about the topic, so long as they say their name first before they answer
That
the
would be
question.
fine, as long as they just identify themselves before they answer the question. That'd be perfect.
Okay. And if you forget, I'll try to remind you about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to begin with the issue of vegetation management and vegetation management program here at Grayson. You all here at Grayson heard some discussion today about what the budget is, what the actual spending was in 2019, and what a certain proposal might be. So I just want to get some clarification on that. First of all, what is the current yearly budget at Grayson for right-of-way vegetation management?
This is Bradley Cherry. Our current budget for vegetation management is at $1.8 million.
Now, was less than $1.8 million actually spent in the year of 2020?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Do you know off the top of your head what that amount was?
I do not have that number, and we would be able to provide that in a follow-up.
That's okay. I'll put you on the spot, but I think there was some mention that there was a reduction. Is it fair to say it was less than 1.8 million?
Yes, that is correct. There has been a reduction. Part of that has been due to the pandemic. When COVID-19 and the pandemic started, we did make a necessary effort in the beginning to look at our costs, look at our expenses, to control those expenses with the unknown of what was coming forward. As we started to ramp our vegetation management back up, we did run into some issues with crews returning due to their own COVID restrictions and them not being able to bring back the same number of crews that they did have.
As you prepare, or as we've now entered into 2021, do you have a plan in mind in 2021 to return to the 1.8 level, or?
We have, in our current budget, we have returned to that just over $1.8 million for vegetation management.
Okay. The number of 2.4 million got mentioned a couple times, and I think that came from request number 48. And I believe that the question was to please estimate the annual cost in 2020 dollars for maintaining distribution circuits, assuming an 8-year vegetation cycle, and the estimated cost to maintain a 5-year cycle. And the 8-year cost was projected at a little over 2.4 million. I think that's where that number came from. Can you explain to the commission why that number is 2.4 versus the 1.8 that's in the budget?
Yes, this is Bradley Cherry again to begin. But I did work with Mike Martin, our assistant manager of operations, who is in charge of our vegetation management. And between the two of us, we came up with that 2.4 million to project out through 2028. If we continued on with the 8-year cycle, that would be what the average cost would be for us to ensure that we met that 8-year cycle.
Okay. And is part of that the fact that you're trying to guess or project what costs may be 8 years from now?
That is correct.
Okay. Have you generally found that your right-of-way costs go up year to year?
They do marginally. We try our best to accomplish with what we have with our budget to keep a $1.8 million level and work with our vegetation management crews to get the most bang for their buck, as Liberty had said.
On your current budget of 1.8 million, is the cooperative on track to continue to maintain the 8-year cycle?
I will let Mike, this is Bradley, and I will let Mike answer that.
This is Mike Martin. And yes,
I want to move on then to the issue of having Grayson's crews do hotline work. And I think one of the recommendations was that rather than having a contractor do that, that more of that be done in-house. So first, I just want to generally ask whoever will be most knowledgeable about that to tell us what the current program is and what plans that the cooperative might have in the future to make changes in that respect.
This is Kyle Clevenger. Well, we don't do hot work now, but we do have guys that are qualified in doing hot work. And then I can utilize those guys to train the other guys that are not proficient in doing hot work. And we can start out, real soon doing hot work. But to get all the guys trained, it may take up to a year. To get some of the other guys up to par. Depends on how many hours, we get in doing hot work. But, you don't do hot work just every day. But, when we do hot work, those hours will count toward the time in order to be certified.
Are there any considerations or complicating factors to having your linemen do hotline work by virtue of the fact that there's a union at Grayson? Does that affect it in any way?
Not really. We still have to consult with the union and make sure that, we do things the right way. But there shouldn't be any issues, really.
Okay. So it sounds like you have some folks able to do it now, and you can come up with a plan to have all of your linemen trained to do hot work. Is that fair for me to say?
Yes.
And I think that there was a timeline identified in one of the recommendations. I think it was the third one. Based upon where you currently are, do you think that timeline, is that something that the cooperative can meet? Let me try to find it. I think the timeline was, this is on page 8 of the action plans, under heading 4, management should train and prepare all line workers for hotline work and begin hotline work by spring 2021. So based upon the current status of affairs and the timeline you gave us for what's required to train someone to do hotline work, is it feasible for Grayson to begin conducting hotline work to some extent in spring of 2021 and then have the entire line and crew trained at some point in the future?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. We've obviously had a lot of talk about reliability and the various indices that are used to measure that. Do you all have any data available about how your 2020 reliability numbers compare to your 2019 reliability numbers?
This is Bradley. We do have some updated outage reporting. For 2020, our SAIDI has decreased by 12.6%. To 338.35 compared to 380.977 in 2019. Our SAFE has decreased by 4.7%, and our KD has decreased by 6.8%.
There was a discussion too about outages that are classified as unknown. Do you have any data on how the number of outages classified as unknown has changed from 2019 to 2020?
This is Bradley, and we do. Our total outages that were labeled as unknown for 2020 we're 23 compared to 116 last year. We also have the total consumers affected by unknown outages down 779 to 95, and our total consumer minutes and hours have also decreased as well.
And do you know what things cause that significant of a reduction in the classification as unknown?
We have made a concise effort to address this with our maintenance and with our construction men as they go out to determine these outages, and to fix the outages first and then to determine what caused the outage. And we've had some direct training with them. We have focused our safety meetings on these issues to help reflect, the importance of determining causes and determining these outages to help us better prepare for the future.
There was some discussion in the report about the use of overtime, primarily by line workers, I believe. Do you have any data you can report to the commission today, having just completed 2020, as far as how Grayson's overtime hours of 2020 compared to its overtime hours of 2019?
This is Bradley, and our overtime hours from 2019 were 5,448 hours, or at a cost of just over $306,000. For 2020, those overtime hours were reduced to 3,914 for a cost of just over $219,000.
What are the most common causes or the most common reasons why you have linemen who are incurring overtime? Whoever's most knowledgeable about that.
Ask a question again.
Yeah, what would you say are the most common reasons why you find linemen getting overtime? What's the primary draw?
Well, weather related.
Sorry.
Kyle Clevenger, fortunately a lot of weather related, off-road with trees, animals, squirrels.
Is it fair for me to say that the biggest driver of the overtime hours is outage restoration rather than planned maintenance?
Yes.
There was a mention in the report, possibly the action plan, about doing temporary repairs for outage restoration as opposed to a permanent repair on the spot in an effort to reduce overtime hours. Is that something Grayson currently does from time to time?
Yes, anytime we can, temporary something to make it safe, we will. But there's times you can't, and so and then there's times that it's in a remote area, and it's affecting just a handful of people, and it could be a hazard. Then we for our men, then we may postpone it till next morning their daylight hours.
Okay. So that's something that does factor into the decision making here, I'll take it.
Yes.
There was a discussion about having an outside party do a pole testing program, sort of the boring into the poles and treating them and stuff like that. And I'm not sure this came up during the interviews earlier of the audit plan, but is that something Grayson's ever tried before, having a pole testing program like that?
This is Robert Brown. Yes, we tried it in 2018. We tested 100 poles out of 10 circuits to try to get a sample.
And I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but do you remember, generally speaking, what the results were?
Yes, we had about, Robert Brown, sorry. We were at about a 3% rejection rate of 1,029 poles.
Excuse me, Chairman?
Yes.
I'm sorry, could I have Mr. Brown repeat that? I couldn't understand what the number was.
Can you repeat your answer, Mr. Brown?
Yes. It was 3% out of 1,029 poles tested.
And when you say that, do you mean that they tested as being rotted or having a defect of some type?
That's correct.
Okay. Moving on, there was some discussion about poles of the cooperative service territory whose age is unknown. And it looks like there were quite a number of them that were designated in that fashion. How did that number of poles come to be classified as unknown? What caused that?
Robert Brown, in 2016, we implemented a GIS program, and we did a full inventory of our system. We hired a company to come in to do that. When the company come in, we had them take a look at the brand that's on each pole, and to give us the date and the pole size of that pole. And we had, if they could not identify that label, if it was worn off, or then it was marked as unknown. And that's why we have so many unknown.
This is Bradley. Just to kind of add to that, before that implementation there, our poles were not tagged. So we could not cross-reference any pole that was out there to these records or to any previous records. During our GIS implementation, we did tag all of our poles to alleviate that problem in the future.
How are poles tagged now, or if you set a new pole, how do you tag it?
Robert Brown, the lineman will actually tag a 6-digit number with GRECC tag onto that pole.
And will that give some information then that you can cross-reference in the system that'll help you know the age of that pole going forward, assuming that's a new pole?
Robert Brown, yes, it will. With the GIS system, the new mapping system we got, we know moving forward when that pole is replaced. We actually take a picture of that pole now. So,
With respect to the poles that predated that system, whose age could not be determined, I assume here at the headquarters building, there's a room somewhere that's got old papers, work orders, bills, receipts, things like that. Is there any way at this time to take that paperwork and match it to those poles whose age is unknown, if they don't have a tag on it?
Robert Brown, not that I'm aware of.
Is there any way, as you sit here today, other than by performing some boring test or something like that, if the pole doesn't have a tag, is there any way you're aware of to now determine the age of that pole?
Robert Brown, we kind of know when we use certain types of poles. For instance, like a CCA pole is a green colored pole. We know about the age in the 80s to 90s when we use those poles. And then we went to a pinup pole after that. So we kind of have an idea of somewhat.
So there may be some distinguishing characteristics of a pole that can help you ballpark it, but not exactly put a specific date to it.
Robert Brown, that's correct.
Has Grayson made any changes with respect to its maintenance of poles in the past few years in an effort to prolong the life of them?
It's Mike Martin. Yeah, we started putting the cap on the top.
Okay.
But keeps weather out.
Okay.
That's one thing we've done.
Helps keep water from getting into the
Getting in
poles.
the top of the pole. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Mr. Chairman, that's all the questions I have at this time.
Who was that last gentleman that answered, please?
The reporter would like to know the identity of the last gentleman who spoke, other than Mr. Oswald, correct? Witness? Mr. Oswald,
Mike
can you
Martin.
tell her that?
Mike Martin.
Mr. Martin.
Thank you.
Ms. Fensel, questions?
Yes, I have a few. Let me ask a quick housekeeping question, Chairman. If it's acceptable to you, can we go back to a split screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. While our IT staff takes care of that, I'll go ahead and start asking some questions. I just want to remind everybody, particularly, and Grayson, particularly with the masks on, we'll need you to speak a little louder and perhaps a little slower so that we can make sure we catch everything. And thank you very much. Let me start by asking about the professional engineer who retired. Did he, in fact, the engineer that Grayson was using as a part-time contractor, did he retire? And if so, what is Grayson doing in regards to a professional engineer?
This is Brian Poling. He did in fact retire, and we have received some quotes from other professional engineers that we are evaluating, but we have not picked one.
Thank you. I have some questions actually based on the discussion this morning, but also on Mr. Oswald's cross-examination. Typically, under these circumstances, we would not do a post-hearing data request, but based upon the discussion this morning and Mr. Oswald's direct examination, I'm hearing some changes from the comments that were filed on December 10th. So let me first go back. These comments that were filed on December 10th, they were filed in response to a preliminary version of the audit report. Is that correct?
This is Bradley. That is correct.
Okay, thank you. And there are certain differences between the preliminary report and the draft report in terms of, let's say, for example, comment 1. Is that correct? Let me tell you what comment 1 is a revision to one of the facts that was in the preliminary report regarding whether or not all poles are double grounded. And as Grayson pointed out, it is all equipment poles that are double grounded. I'll give you a few moments to look for that. And Mr. Rhodes, could I ask that the view for the hearing software, thank you. Thank you very much. And would you agree with me that that's correct, that change was made?
This is Bradley. Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Okay. What I'm going to ask now is that Grayson refile comments and point by point through the recommendations file their response to each recommendation. For example, to the recommendation for the hotline work, indicate, again, I know that there is a separate management audit case, and Grayson has provided some information in that case. What I'm going to ask is that Grayson, for example, to the hotline work, indicate that some of its staff are already qualified, not all staff are qualified, and as you testified this morning, you believe that you can meet that spring 2021 deadline with the understanding that not all staff would be trained. So what I'm asking is when you respond to each one of these recommendations, your response includes whether or not you believe you can meet that deadline, if you can meet it partially, or if you really think you can't meet it, so that the commission has a better understanding of Grayson's position. Okay? We can talk at the end of this hearing. I'm sure the chairman will ask about a timeline for that. I also would like to get a clarifying question. As was discussed by the vice chairman, in one of two of the comments, Grayson had referenced concerns about the cost of various recommendations. And this morning, Mr. Antonuck reiterated that what Grayson was looking at was that balancing, not looking necessarily to increase your costs, looking at reliability and the fact, for example, with pole testing, that pole testing could reduce the pole replacement costs so that the cost would be offset. given Mr. Antonuk's testimony in regard to this report, would you revise any of your comments in regards to your concerns about the costs of the recommendations?
This is Bradley. In regard to those comments, we would still be concerned about being forced to increase any costs to meet recommendations. However, their recommendations and the marginal cost for the benefits that they would provide, as long as they were not a requirement and they could be reviewed on an as-needed basis, then yes, we would be acceptable of that.
Okay. And I think Mr. Cherry and Mr. Martin may have already heard this, but I don't know that I heard it clearly. What is the budget for 2021 for vegetation management?
This is Bradley. It is just over $1.8 million.
Okay, so roughly the same as in 2020.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Because you've addressed the issues of the hotline work or hot work and employee overtime, I'm not going to ask any questions about it. I do want to note for the record that the recommendations made in this audit are very similar to recommendations that were made in 2019-00101, which is the other management audit of Grayson, and it's a financial and operations management audit. I recognize that was not a question. I just want to make sure I get that into the record. In regard to recommendation number 1, the trial retention of an arborist, have you had any discussions with EKPC to see if they have an arborist on staff?
This is Mike Martin. Yes, I did. And they do have an arborist on staff, but he doesn't do arborist work. That's not what he's doing.
And in your discussions, did you have any discussion as to whether or not there could be some sort of an arrangement to pay EKPC to use this arborist for Grayson?
This is Mike Martin. No, I didn't bring that up with him because I got the picture that he doesn't do that anymore.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear, he doesn't do that anymore? Okay.
Yeah, they have an arborist on staff, but that's not the job that he does.
Okay, I understand, thank you.
Yeah.
So from your answer, I take it he doesn't have anything to do with being an arborist?
It's Mike Martin. He said he does something, right-of-way specialist, but he doesn't do arborist work.
Okay. I'm wondering, have you had any discussions with, I don't want to use too many acronyms, the Kentucky Association of Electric Co-ops about this issue?
Yeah, this is Mike Martin. I talked to 2 other co-ops about if they use an arborist or who they use.
Okay.
And both of those use retired forestry guys.
I don't want to go too far down the line and have too much repetition, but I do want to make sure we cover this. It would be helpful to get that kind of information in the comments, that in response to the recommendations. So perhaps some actions, including their action steps that Grayson has taken so far and the outcome. And I will also offer up to Mr. Oswald, if you have any questions, and to Mr. Cherry, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to let me know. In regard to vegetation management, how does Grayson evaluate the effectiveness of the vegetation management program? I don't want to make this a multiple question, and I'm going to, I'm sorry. Is it primarily as we've discussed earlier, safety, Katie, data?
This is Mike Martin. Mainly, from my point of view on it, you can look at the overtime hours in an area after the circuit's been cut and it goes drastically down. Barring there's not a, storm or something like that, it's normal.
So looking at it, if I understand correctly then, so looking at it in terms of a reduction in overtime hours in a particular area, again, because addressing the vegetation management and the impact that has on reduced outages, and then reduced outages also reduces the amount of time that the crew has to go out and do repair, to do that type of work. Is that a correct path of thinking?
This is Mike Martin, yes.
Thank you. I have a question about recommendation number 4, which is in regard to a structured program to document and evaluate work activities addressing the previous year's worst performing circuits. In the comments, there was a question about, well, let me say that the recommendation was that Grayson should begin documenting outage causes for worst performing circuits by January 2021. Consistent with your earlier testimony, is it correct that those initial steps have been taken?
This is Bradley. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. In regard to recommendation number 4, which is to document and then to be able to evaluate, but to begin documenting the work activities that address the worst performing circuits. And the point of the documentation is that so Grayson can evaluate what they've done and develop your own internal best practice guidelines. So my question is, given that the initial steps of this documentation, of this recommendation is to begin documenting the work activities, is there a reason why Grayson cannot start that recommendation?
This is Bradley. Yes, ma'am. We can start. We've already had some internal discussions on how we are going to document and how we are going to report
Okay.
this information.
Thank you. I was a little confused with the comment from Grayson, the December 10th comment, comment number 2. Grayson seemed to be referencing both the identifying the outages and the documentation. And I think I'm going to reserve further question, but I would ask you to look at that and see how that aligns with your testimony this morning and whether you're still concerned that you cannot meet that January 2021 deadline. Does that make sense to you?
This is Bradley. I'm currently reviewing our comment right now.
Okay.
In our previous audit, this was also addressed as well with our outages and properly identifying them. We have already begun steps towards that. I believe our comment was mostly made knowing that we would not have the final report and our action plans completed by January of 2021. I believe that they are due by the end of the month, and we were concerned of any additional comments or any additional recommendations that we may receive that we would not be able to implement at that time. Currently, with what we have, we do not foresee that to be an issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That really kind of leads to a second question, which in regard to having two audit cases, would there be a benefit to Grayson if the two cases were merged at this point so that there was one set of guidelines, recommendations with deadlines and prioritization? Would that be helpful to Grayson?
This is Bradley. I believe it would, as long as, we had clear guidelines, especially as you have read in our comments, just the prioritization and just the recommendations and the expectations from the commission and their staff of the balancing between the two if there are any conflicts.
Okay. Thank you. I need to go back to something Mr. Brown and Mr. Cherry said about the tags on the poles. I want to make sure that I'm understanding something. Under commission regulations, and it's, just for the record, it's 807 KAR 5006, section 21. Each utility owning poles should mark every pole with the initials or distinguishing mark by which the owner can be readily determined. So when you talk about that Grayson's utility poles were not tagged until until the GIS effort, you're speaking about a different type of tag than is required by the regulation. Is that correct?
This is Robert Brown. Before we started tagging the poles in 2016, we always put a property of Grayson RECC tag on each pole.
Thank you. I thought that was the case, but I wanted to double check and make sure so we didn't have an open question left. Thank you. In regard to the issue about a professional pole testing contractor, what process does Grayson use when it engages a third-party contractor?
This is Bradley. We would begin soliciting bids for a contractor. What we would receive back as a group or as a team, we would evaluate those based on cost, based on safety, based on reliability, based on all the factors that we determine would be crucial for selecting the contractor. And then from there, we would select the contractor based on that, based on the recommendations by the parties involved, and then proceed forward from there.
The recommendation to hire a third-party pole testing and treatment contractor recommends that this be done by April 1st, 2021. I'm just going to ask, setting aside any cost issues in terms of a timeline, is that a feasible timeline?
This is Bradley. We believe so.
Chairman, I do not have any further questions at this time.
Vice Chairman Chandler, questions?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just a couple. Let me go back to the question that Ms. Vincent was asking a second ago about the tags used to identify the poles. So, 1 second here. The regulation talks about that each utility owning poles. Ms. Vincent identified it, but Section 21 pole identification. Talks about how not only do you have to identify the owner, but it also requires that a utility shall either number its structures and maintain a numbering system or use some other method of identification so that each structure in the system can be easily identified. So, I mean, I guess what I would ask is it that you all just identified the pole as belonging to you all, but you didn't necessarily know any identifying information about the pole. Is that fair?
This is Robert Brown. I would say that'd be correct.
Okay, so you all have a numbering system now, but not necessarily prior to the GIS work in 2016.
Yes, all our poles are tagged and numbered. This is Robert Brown, sorry.
Okay, and that as a follow-on to maybe what the chairman was asking earlier, or just bring it up earlier with it's almost 10,000, I think on page 16 of the Liberty Report, almost 10,000 poles that were identified as unknown age. Those are now, all 10,000 of those that were identified as unknown in the GIS study in 2016, you all have at least identified and numbered those as of today. Is that fair?
This is Robert Brown, that's correct, and we took a picture of them.
Okay, and then, so that brings me to the other thing, is that regulation with the poles, I guess I was just thrown off because as I also read section 25 of the same, section 26, sorry, of the same regulation, with regards to inspections, one of the inspections requirements is that at intervals not to exceed 2 years, the utility shall inspect all electric facilities operating at voltages of less than 69 kV. And then it lists a couple of those. Do you all inspect poles all the poles every 2 years?
Kyle Clevenger, our boys, they do a 2-year inspection on their circuits in their area. And they go through and they check the poles, test them. I mean, they sound check them and do a visual check on their poles in their area.
Right. So I get, and it talks about this. These are the from the ground inspections. So every pole gets inspected from the ground every 2 years. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I'm just sort of trying to understand, prior to 2016, how did you all identify poles that were unidentifiable per the information on the pole for whether it got inspected, what the condition of it was, whether it needed replacement, and I guess prior to, I asked that question, and I'm glad to get the information because I'm glad to understand that it's not necessarily unidentified. There's not 10,000 unidentified now. There's just 10,000 from the GIS that didn't have the information. So I guess how before 2016 did you all identify whether a pole was inspected or what the condition was if you had 10,000, which is, now a third, I don't know how many it was back in 2016, a third of your polls didn't have any identifying information. Well, so you're looking at every poll every 2 years, right? You're looking at every meter every 2 years. And if you look at a meter, right, that's in the same regulation. You look at a meter, you can mark down the meter number and check off that you looked at that meter and what condition it was in, whether it was need to be replaced or not, right?
Yes.
This is Robert Brown. I'll answer your question.
Okay.
So when we would go out and the maintenance man would check a pole, a lot of times we put a yellow tag on that pole that needed to be looked at or changed out. And then an engineer would go back and take a look at that pole to see if it needed to be changed out or not. We would give an address about where that pole was located at. So that's how, even though they still check the poles every 2 years, but when they found one that was bad, we put a yellow ribbon around that pole to be changed out, to have it looked at.
So just to be, okay, so it was effectively every 2 years, it was a pass-fail test. And if the person inspecting thought that it was going to be a fail or they had a concern with it, they would tag it for further review or replacement. And then if they didn't have a concern with it to that degree, it just didn't get tagged and they'd come back another 2 years. Is that fair to sort of explain the process that was previously used?
It's Robert Brown, yes.
Okay. The calculation of, as I understand it, of Sadie and Safey and Katie and maybe even KPI, that they all are, that the standards, that it's a standardized calculation with, it's supposed to be, the same for every utility, municipality, whatever it may be. Everybody uses the same, as I understand it, IEEE standard for that calculation. Is that accurate for Grayson, at least, that they use that same IEEE standard to determine the calculation of those metrics, and including the calculation of major event days?
This is Brian Bowling. Yes, that is true.
Okay. And have you all changed your methodology over the last couple of years, by any chance?
We have not, the calculation itself is the same. The process of gathering the data has changed because we went to a formal OMS system, outage management system, that gave us a little more accurate data. And once we got historical data in that, it started doing the calculations for us.
Okay. And on that, has Grayson noticed any significant change in major event days? Whether those have been increasing or decreasing over the last few years in calculation of those metrics?
This is Brian Poland. The major event days have been decreasing.
Have been decreasing?
Decreasing, yes, going less, getting less, and that's just based on the weather conditions that we've had.
Okay. I think those are all the questions I have. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Matthews, questions?
Just a couple. We heard a lot about pole toppers, I believe, in the last rate case, so I wanted to follow up on that a little bit. Do you know if any other utilities in Kentucky use this in order to try to preserve their poles longer?
Kyle Clevenger, yes, I've checked with some of the other co-ops and they do use them. I mean, you don't take, the pole topper, what it does, it protects the top of the pole from absorbing moisture down through the top. And decaying, a lot of times that first 2 foot or 3 foot of that pole, it gets a lot weather and over time it will absorb moisture and rot and decay. So, we started using those about 2 years ago. And we put them on every new pole, and any pole that we're on that pole, we will, even though if it's a good pole, we'll put them on. But yeah, I've checked with other co-ops, and they use them also.
Okay, so do you have any data on the effectiveness, or the 2-year period really hasn't been long enough for you to determine?
No, we have, long enough.
Okay. And then I have another question, and it's maybe, this is directed toward Mr. Cherry. What is your title?
I am the interim president and CEO.
Okay, what is the timeline for getting a full-time permanent president and CEO?
That is based on, with our previous president and CEO, some background issues with that. The timeline should be fairly soon. The issues, I am not at liberty to discuss without it being confidential.
Okay. Are you a candidate for the permanent full-time CEO position?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Chairman, that's the only questions that I have.
Would you like to go into confidential session to obtain an answer to your question?
I will ask if you and the vice chairman are also interested in that, and if so, we can do that. If not, we can look at that in another instance.
Vice Chairman?
No, if Commissioner Matthews has given me a lot of leeway over the last few months and asking as many questions as I would like, so I defer to her if she would like to go into it to get an answer to her question, whatever she would like.
And I think I think it would be important to kind of know that timeline because of the recommendations and the changes with the 2 management audits. Having a permanent leader might give us more comfort that these long-term changes will be made. That's just
Well, why don't
the
we do-
reason I would be interested.
It won't take long. Let's just go into executive or confidential session here, and so we can follow up with a few questions and get that information now. Okay. All right, we're now back into open or public session. Is there anything else, Mr. Oswald, that you want to ask your witnesses, or Ms. Pencil, that you want to ask the witnesses for Grayson RECC?
I have no further questions for them.
Okay. What about any questions for Liberty Group?
I have no further questions for Liberty.
Okay. Well, at that point then, may Liberty's witness may now get off of the video. They may be excused. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes, yes.
Mr. Oswald, is that fine with you? May Liberty's witnesses be excused at this time?
It is. I have no more questions for Liberty or for Grayson.
All right, well, Liberty's 3 witnesses. We certainly appreciate your cooperation and your being here and providing your evidence for us this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Now, Mr. Oswald, I guess we're pretty much at the end of the hearing. What I want to ask you, though, at this time is there anything else you'd like to bring to the Commission's attention? Any motion or anything else that you think that we ought to know or be aware of?
No, Mr. Chairman, I can think of nothing at this time. I just say briefly, on behalf of Grayson, we just would like to thank the auditor as well and the staff and the commissioners for working with us through this process. And it sounds like the next step is for Grayson to fill out their action plans and get those submitted. And they're working on that as we speak.
I think I guess Ms. Vinsel asked, I guess that in view of the fact we have a final report that Grayson, I guess, update its responses, including the information about your current status of your, I guess, vegetation plan and some other things you mentioned. And I don't know if it'd be helpful, Ms. Vinsel, if you could submit that in a writing, or if you're satisfied that your oral statement will suffice in terms of providing Grayson with enough information to get the detailed answers you might want.
If it's acceptable, Chairman, may I ask Mr. Oswald, would you like greater clarification?
So the way I took what was said earlier was, you're not wanting a different document from us. You're just saying that in the action plan for Grayson to set out what steps it has taken so far toward that particular topic, and whether or not it believes that the proposed timeline is feasible, and if not, why not, in addition to the obviously having the action plan.
Yes, that would be acceptable in the action plan, as long as there's an understanding that each of the recommendations is addressed with. It sounds like I should probably put something in writing, Chairman.
Okay.
But yes, I do believe that we need to have all steps that were taken to deal with the recommendations through this hearing, and then Grayson's plans going forward. So I will put something in writing.
Okay, how much time do you need to draft something?
I can,
We're not under, it's not a big hurry. I mean, I know you have other things you're working on.
I do have another thing I'm working on.
Yeah.
I definitely can have something out by January 13th.
All right, Mr. Oswald, I know you don't know exactly, I think you've got an idea, probably a complete idea of the type of response that Ms. Vincent wants, but you wait obviously till you get her writing if you choose. But how much time after the 13th do you think you or your client will need to put together the responses that you generally know that she wants?
Chairman, I don't want to interrupt either you or Mr. Oswald, but I do want to throw in, we do have a current procedural schedule that I'm going to propose that we revise.
All right, what is our procedural schedule now?
We're supposed to have, I believe we need to have an action plan by early February. I believe it's the final action plan. I would propose, let me double check my dates here. It looks like it's February 26th now, so I think that should be sufficient from staff's point of view.
Approval for you guys.
Is that satisfactory still, Mr. Oswald?
Yes, Chairman, it is.
So how much time do you think you'll need to provide the information? And if you need more time, basically just file a motion.
Okay.
Chairman, it would be acceptable to staff if they would include that information in their action plan that they file February 26th.
Oh, all right, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't understand. All right, so you've got it until February 25th. That gives you plenty of time, right? Okay. All right, is there anything else, Ms. Vincent or Mr. Oswald? If not, this hearing is adjourned, and thank you all very much. Appreciate your attendance and your testimony.